if you choose to see obesity through a simple lens, you're going to stay really on the surface and see that, yeah, obesity is caused by eating too much and not exercising enough or not moving the body enough. And yeah, that might be the conclusion that you draw. However, the more and more you dig and the more and more you look at the complex array of interrelated factors that are associated with obesity, you start peeling away more and more of the onion and seeing more and more of the picture and seeing more and more how each individual arrives at their current weight in a very different way. And so there's many things that can promote obesity and that can be seen alongside of obesity as well. And one thing that we don't often talk enough about is the association between obesity and psychological trauma. So that's what we're going to explore in this unit. But before we get there, I just wanted to say that some of the things we're going to talk about are, I don't know, I find them uncomfortable to talk about, and I had a hard time putting this unit together, if I'm being honest, because exploring this body of literature, it's hard. You know, it's hard to hear about what some people go through, and you know, not just individuals with obesity, but all sorts of people that have been through, you know, a lot of stuff, a lot of trauma in their lives, and the different ways that the effects of trauma can manifest. And so one of the ways that the effects of trauma can manifest is in obesity. And I'm going to show you some research that supports that point. But just a note that there are some difficult things that we're going to be talking about, and some things, like I said, that make me very uncomfortable. And if you've gone through some things yourself that you see kind of mirrored in some of the things we're talking about, I just ask you to approach this content very cautiously and kindly with yourself and compassionately with yourself. And well, if you're an SFU student and you need extra guidance with something that you might have been through yourself, there is health and counseling. There's the MySSP app. You can always come talk to me and I can kind of help direct you as well. But like I said, just be super cautious and kind and compassionate with yourself as you listen to this content, because some of it I find very, very emotionally arousing, and I'm assuming a lot of other people will as well. So just a little content warning there. So I'm going to be talking about psychological trauma. And before we do that, let's define that term. So the word trauma comes from a Greek word, which really reflects like a wound or some sort of hurt. And I've seen other definitions where it's actually an unhealed wound, which I thought is a very interesting thought around trauma. If you look at the definition that's used in the United States by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, which is kind of like the Canadian Mental Health Association, but in the States, their definition of trauma is individual trauma results. So it's the result, right, from something that happens to you, right, from a series of events or a set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful. So sometimes it's a physical hurt or an emotional hurt, and sometimes it can be the thing that happened to a person can be life-threatening. And the thing with trauma is there's some sort of lasting effect of it. And this lasting effect, so someone went through something in the past that stays with them. And I think we all have a level of that. So sometimes trauma is actually divided into what's called big T trauma versus little t trauma. And what this means is like big T trauma would be like some sort of major thing that someone went through. So like the experiences of war or some sort of abuse in early childhood. That would be some like seeing a parent die. Those are like big T traumas. Little t traumas, we all have these. These are like little things, smaller events, less, let's say, traumatic in theory, events that some of us have gone through that have left lasting impressions on us. Okay. And I love this definition by kind of the big name in trauma these days, who's Gabor Mate, who's actually his practice was primarily in Vancouver on the downtown east side. He's worked with a lot of people with substance abuse issues, etc., seen kind of all the sides of trauma and how it manifests. And I love this line that trauma is not what happens to you. Trauma is what happens inside of you as a result of what happens to you. And in the video where he explains this definition, I like that he takes a positive approach, which is like, you can't change what happened to you. Right? And so it's good that trauma isn't actually what happened to you, but it's how that's kind of manifested, what's kind of happened inside of your body because of what happened to you. Because like I said, you can't change what happened to you, but you can seek ways of helping to manage the feelings inside of yourself or the lasting impressions of what happened to you. And this often takes outside work. And this often requires outside help of a professional. But I like the fact that it's just because something happened to you doesn't mean that that is going to be a detriment to your life forever, necessarily. Okay? And I don't want to diminish anyone's experience. There's all sorts of levels of trauma, but there are professionals out there that can help certain people work through the trauma that they are experiencing. So just a definition of trauma to help us move forward with it. So how do we measure trauma? Now, when we're talking about psychological trauma, this can happen at any point in our lives, but I've chosen in this unit to focus on what's called ACEs, right? So ACE stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. And this term really started in the late 90s, which is kind of when a lot of this trauma research really just got its foundations, based on this study by Folletti et al. And this researcher wanted to kind of examine some of the lasting effects of the adverse childhood experiences that people had. If you had these childhood experiences, were you at a higher risk of certain things happening later on in your life? Were you at a higher risk of cardiovascular disease? The answer is yes. Were you at a higher risk of type 2 diabetes? The answer is yes. Were you at a higher risk of substance abuse? The answer is yes. So they did this kind of seminal study back in the late 90s that started to link some of the childhood traumas that some people experience with, some of the manifestations of that trauma. So the next slide is one of the ones that I find a bit triggering. So just be careful as we approach this. So this is the ACE questionnaire, the original ACE questionnaire, and it's a series of 10 questions that asks people about their experiences before they turned 18. And so you can read through some of the questions on here, but they have to do with was your parent an alcoholic? Did your parents divorce? Did you feel humiliated? Did you feel shamed? Did you feel that no one loved you? Oh my God, it's just hard to even talk about this stuff. Did someone go to prison? Did you experience these things that can potentially have really adverse effects, be an adverse experience that could have these lasting effects? So basically, the more yeses you had, that would be a higher score. So if I just had one of these, right, I would have an ACE score of 1, right? If I experienced 4 of these, that's an ACE score of 4, okay? So using that knowledge, they started linking the number of ACE scores, how did they put it? Number of categories with the likelihood of developing certain diseases and conditions, right? And the paper is actually worth looking up because it goes into all sorts of things and chronic diseases and substance abuse patterns, etc. But this is, for our purposes, the area that I think is worth looking at. So what they found is that the more ACE scores an individual had, the higher the risk of what they called severe obesity, so a BMI of over 35. So how to read these odds ratios is you'll notice in each category there's a 1. 1 is always the reference value. Okay, so you read this as compared to people, so it says 1.6. I know I kind of wrote around it, but this says 1.6. So compared to people who had 0 adverse childhood experiences, individuals with 4 or more adverse childhood experiences had about a 60% extra chance of developing what they called severe obesity. So even having 3 adverse childhood experiences or 2 adverse childhood experience increased the risk of obesity by about 40%. And just because the one underneath kind of follows from that as well, right? Having more ACE experiences also increase the likelihood that an individual wouldn't participate in leisure time physical activity. It also significantly increased the risk that an individual would have depression, a depressed mood in the past year, 2 or more weeks of a depressed mood in the past year. So up to 4.5 times more likely. So someone that's had 4 or more adverse childhood experiences was more than 4 times more likely to have experienced that depressed mood in the past year compared to those that hadn't had an ACE score of 0. So we're starting to build a picture, and we're starting to build a picture that these adverse childhood experiences and these early life experiences we have lingering effects. And they have lingering effects on things like mood, they have lingering effects on things like, our behaviors, and they have lingering effects on propensity for obesity. So that study was about adverse childhood experiences and a whole slew of potential outcomes. This study from 2013, which was a systematic review and meta-analysis, looked at the effects of various aspects of childhood abuse on the likelihood for developing adult obesity. And so they looked at, in their study, they included about 23 cohort studies with an N of over 100,000 people. And what they found once they ran new stats on this and reviewed the data, what was seen overall, the picture that emerged is that individuals that had experienced physical abuse were about 28% more likely to have obesity as an adult. Those that experienced emotional abuse, even higher risk. So they had about a 36% increased risk of obesity. People that experienced sexual abuse, something similar. They had about a 31% increased risk of obesity. And with abuse in general, we had about an almost 50% increased risk of obesity, having had what was called in these studies general abuse. So again, we're building more evidence to show that there's some sort of link between these negative events early on in life and an increased risk for that manifesting in a higher risk of obesity. And to add another layer to this, they actually saw somewhat of a dose-response relationship as well. Whereas the higher the level of abuse, right? So comparing light to moderate levels of abuse, it's hard to even talk about this stuff, but anyways, right? Comparing light to moderate levels of abuse with severe abuse, those who experienced more severe abuse had about a 50% increased risk compared to those that experienced light to moderate abuse. They had about a 13% higher risk of obesity. So their concluding statement, which I thought was worth reading out here, is that this meta-analysis of prospective and retrospective cohort studies, including data from 7 countries and over 112,000 participants, unequivocally showed that childhood abuse increased the risk of adult obesity. So one of the questions that came to me after looking through this material is like, well, how actually common are these ACEs, are these adverse childhood experiences? And unfortunately, the answer is more common than I would have thought. So a survey of over 214,000 US adults across 23 states found that like 60%, right? So 3/5 of people have had at least one adverse childhood experience, whereas a quarter of individuals had had 3 or more adverse childhood experience. And there were some demographic groups that had an even higher risk of having 3 or more ACEs. So again, it's easy to just look at obesity and be like, well, you eat too much and you don't exercise enough, and that's why you have obesity. But it's always important that to just remember that there's so much going on below the surface. There's so many reasons why some people might have a propensity to eat more. There's so many reasons why some people have a propensity to move less. And there's so many differences in physiology that increases risk for obesity in some individuals than others. And we often leave psychology out of our understanding of obesity. And it's such an important part that we need to be aware of, especially if we're working with individuals with obesity that have developed obesity because of, perhaps as a direct result of some of the psychological things that they've gone through in their lives. So, next question I had about this material is like, how? How does going through some sort of psychological trauma increase the risk of obesity? And as I give you some potential mechanisms, it's really important, as always, to be very cautious about giving causality to one particular thing and saying, oh, it's because of this, oh, it's because of that. As we've learned over and over in this class, things are complex. Things manifest in our body in a complex, because of complex interrelated factors. So it's probably not one of the things that I'm going to suggest on the next few slides. It's probably some sort of combination, and the combination would be different for each individual that has obesity that's primarily driven by psychological factors. Okay? And that's something, that's a good point here too. If there was abuse in a child's life, there might have probably been a lot of other dysfunctional aspects of their lives that might have led to a propensity for fat deposition. Okay, so the authors of that original study, the 1998 study of ACEs, they offered this conceptual model that gave kind of a framework of how these adverse childhood experiences could lead to things like cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, and obesity, right? And basically they argued that because of these things, there were changes in social, emotional, and cognitive impairments that increased the risk for these individuals to adopt healthy risk behaviors, right? They might have adopted, for instance, unhealthy coping behaviors, right? And I say unhealthy, but a coping behavior, we might look at like overeating. So let's say someone overeats as a coping behavior. We might look at that as a negative thing, but at the time where that person originally used eating as a coping behavior, that is something that that person was using to self-soothe. And it might have been the only thing that made that person feel good. So it makes perfect sense that that would be something that lingers because maybe they didn't feel very good and food made them feel good, for instance, right? So it was it might be an unhealthy behavior now, but at the time, it might have been the only thing that brought that person a sense of peace in a time in their lives when things were all but peaceful. Okay, so this is this was the original framework that they argued as to how ACEs lead to things like obesity and cardiovascular disease. But the research has kind of gone on from there, and it's still kind of new in its development. But some of the things that we also see with ACEs is we see elevated inflammation in individuals that have higher ACE scores and have had various psychological traumas in their life. We also see kind of increased stress levels. And stress can promote obesity in a number of ways. It can change our behaviors, for instance. Some people eat more when they're stressed, but also having, for instance, higher cortisol level increases the risk for fat deposition in the abdominal region. So there's an association between stress and obesity as well. Okay. We also saw sleep disturbances in individuals that have had higher ACE scores and emotional trauma. We haven't learned this yet, but disturbed sleep is something that increases the risk of obesity. There's kind of really nice data on that. It's pretty clear that having poor sleep quality can affect risk for obesity. Okay. Also, because having more of these adverse experiences increases the risk for other psychological issues that also are linked with obesity, right? There is that other link there too. Okay. And this is more anecdotal. I haven't found really good studies on this, but there have been a number of anecdotal reports and case studies of individuals that have said that, well, I was sexually abused as a kid, and so I gained weight as a way to make myself less attractive. Or I gained weight as a way to make myself more, like, have a larger presence as well. So as we keep looking at, these are complex things that have gone on, and each individual is going to have their own kind of map of these things. Okay. Another link between these traumas and obesity is, food addiction is a controversial topic, but if we use, for instance, the Yale Food Addiction Scale, there has been evidence to support that severe physical and sexual abuse were associated with about a 90% increase in food addiction risk. Okay? And if an individual had both physical and sexual abuse, there was about more than almost a 2.5 increased risk that person would be addicted to food, which again, totally makes sense to me, because people are using food as a coping mechanism because it might be the only thing that makes them feel good. Okay? Another linking mechanism that I find really interesting, actually, and this isn't a study on obesity, this was a study of actually how negative emotional experiences can affect certain areas of the brain. And what they actually found, they looked at adolescents in like 2 key points in their lives. I forget exactly what years, I want to say like between 11 and 13, something like that, and the changes in brain regions. Okay, so they looked at brain regions at one point in time, and then the same individuals at a second point in time, a couple years later, I believe. And they compared adolescents that had been through emotional trauma and those that hadn't. And what they found is that individuals that had been through emotional trauma, they had less development in what's known as the ventral striatum. And we'll talk about this later in this course when we start talking about the reward value of food and what's called hedonic eating and non-homeostatic appetite. But basically, we have this reward center in our brain that, like, in part makes us seek out food, right? And as a way of, like, finding reward from that food. It's more complex than that, but that's just kind of an easier way of putting it. And what they suggest is if there's less development in this region, there might be less of a reward responsiveness. What does that mean? It might mean that people that have been through these emotional traumas, they don't get the reward of food as much, so they need to eat more to get that reward, if that makes sense. Okay, so this needs to be teased out a little bit more, but it's just adding more potential mechanisms linking these traumas and the development of obesity. Okay, so to put this all together, there is a clear association between psychological trauma and obesity, but we're still teasing this out. This is, like I said, a relatively new area of research. Trauma is becoming a big word these days. A lot of people are talking about it more, which I'm very happy to see. So hopefully our understanding of it keeps developing it more. However, what's unclear is what the exact mechanism linking these two together, and quite probably it's complex. And those things that I just talked about, those linking mechanisms, it's probably some sort of combination of various factors for an individual. Right? So something to keep in mind if you are working with individuals with obesity is that telling someone to eat less or move more is not going to get you anywhere if the reasons why the main reason driving a person's weight has to do with something that they've been through in their past, some sort of hurt they've experienced that they're still wounded from, right? That they're maybe using food to cope with, for instance, right? So, and that's a scope of practice question as well. Like, is that the person that you should be working with? And it kind of depends on what their trauma shows up as. Or is that someone that really needs to be passed on to a health professional, maybe a psychiatrist, maybe a psychologist, maybe a registered clinical counselor that has experience in that area and that can help a person move forward. Okay, later on we'll talk a little bit about trauma-informed care, but I think it's always important to remember scope of practice and what we're qualified to do and what we're not qualified to do as well. Okay, so that kind of brings us to the end of this unit on obesity comorbidities. I hope you learned some things along the way.